is universal, if you like. It has its theory, it has its practice. Nigeria, through the leaders that we had at the time, saw federalism fitting into our circumstances, and they decided to embrace it. In embracing it, they gave our federalism its own slant. So the first thing to know is that there are things that are common that define federalism, but that every country that adopts the federal solution works out its federal solution in accordance with its peculiarities. So, what works for America might not work for Nigeria, might not work for Switzerland, might not work for Brazil. If it works for America, that is true federalism. If it works for Switzerland, that is true federalism. If it works for Nigeria, that is our true federalism. So, you know. Now, in the books, if you really want to discuss federalism, you have to have an entry point. And the entry point is to ask the question, so what is federalism? Now, in contradistinction to, say, the unitary arrangement and the confederal arrangement, the first thing that strikes you is that we're all talking about the relationship between a national and central government and subnational governments. In a unitary system, there is only one determinate center of power, and that's the central government. In a confederal arrangement, it is the constituent units that have the determinate power, and the central authority then becomes like a dependent government. But in a federal system, there's a balance between the power of the center and the power of the constituent units. Now, federalism in general, and this is the theory of it, is guided by two principles. The principle of centralization and therefore decentralization with regard to the jurisdictions of the central government. Because a government has first to centralize before it can decentralize. So when you're dealing with matters that belong to federal jurisdiction, you talk about centralization and decentralization. The opposite of centralization is not decentralization. The opposite of centralization is non-centralization. So, in the jurisdictions that belong to the constituent units in a federal system, the powers that they exercise, at least in theory, cannot be centralized. So if all the powers that the constituent unit has is to manage the schools differently, you allow that state to manage the schools differently. That power, if you take it from that state, it loses its federal flavor because you have now centralized even the management of schools. That's all that can be claimed. Now, federalism suits very much so the circumstances of countries that are troubled by multi-ethnic diversity, for instance, countries that want common defense, because acting alone, you are weaker than if you act in concert with other people. So when the 13 American colonies got together, they discovered that, there is unity and strength that comes with pulling resources together. So if you want common defense, you have federalism. If you want to manage the issues of political accommodation in diversity, you have federalism. So there is a wide variety in the forms that federalism can take. And all over the world, all over the continents, you have federal situations. Now, Carl Frederick is not a Nigerian. Now, but he was the champion of the sociological approach to federalism. And he said, the essence of federalism is not to be found in the Constitution. The essence of federalism is to be found in the nature of the society that the Constitution serves. Why? Because he says that in general you will find that the propelling forces that make federalism necessary come from the dynamics of federal societies and how people conclude that, for certain purposes we want a central government, but for certain other purposes we need to protect our diversity. And that once you have that kind of feeling that requires a balance, that's when generally the need for federalism arises. The working out of the bolts and nuts in the Constitution will then take their bearings from how you define those common features. But it says, when you have a federal arrangement of that kind, it is not something that happens once and for all, because the society that the Constitution serves is not stagnant, it's not static, it is dynamic. And as that society changes, so the demands of governance would also change. Frederick says, when the demands change, the federal instrumentalities, if they are responsive, would also have to change. It is when the instrumentalities don't change that you have a problem with federalism. So, federalism, dealing with changes, is restructuring. And restructuring is federalism. Okay? William Riker is not a Nigerian. Okay? William Riker is not a Nigerian. Now he has federalism and politics. He says that federalism is more often than not the product of a bargain that people freely enter into, which they themselves negotiate, and that what emerges is a project that all of them find themselves in. Using project, let me just be clear. I don't belong to the school in this country that says the Nigeria project. We have a country, a state, a nation called Nigeria. It is not a project. Okay? I have not seen any other country in the world that calls itself a project. So please, when I use project, I use that in relation to federalism, and federalism only. Okay? Now, Riker says that people who come together to bargain and to negotiate what manner of federalism they want are those that then give rise to the peculiar flavor that that federal system has. But he says, in bargaining, it is not likely that the things that make them come together will change if that federal system is going to survive. Please keep this in mind, because I'm going to conclude on a note of what in political science we call games theory, and I'll get back to bargaining. Now, you see, federalism works in many instances, but in many other instances, it does not work. It fails. In fact, there are more failed federations in the world than successful federations. That's the story. Federalism is a very delicate system of government. It's a very difficult system to manage, and there are no guarantees. First, they say federalism can be differentiated on the basis of how it originated. So, in America, 13 colonies got together to form a federal union. In Switzerland, the cantons got together to found a union. In Germany, the Länder got together and they have a union. In Canada, the provinces are there. That is the aggregative process of federalism. The opposite of that is the disaggregative process. And that's where we are, together with India. That Nigeria was a unitary system that was then disaggregated, as it were, for the purposes of federalism. Again, keep this in mind, because we're going to be arguing, to conclude, that the